Sarah Martinez had always believed that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. As a 28-year-old emergency room nurse at San Diego General Hospital, she witnessed daily acts of courage from both her colleagues and patients. But she never imagined that her own moment of heroism would come during what was supposed to be a peaceful evening jog along the Pacific coastline. The sun was setting over Mission Beach, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Sarah had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift and needed to clear her mind. Running had always been her escape, a way to process the intensity of her work and find inner peace. She followed her usual route along the coastal path, her running shoes rhythmically hitting the pavement as waves crashed against the shore below. The beach was moderately crowded with evening joggers, families packing up from day trips and couples enjoying romantic walks. Sarah nodded politely to fellow runners and smiled at children building sandcastles with their parents. Everything seemed perfectly normal until she heard the commotion ahead. A crowd was gathering near the lifeguard station, their voices rising with concern and panic. Sarah slowed her pace, her nursing instincts immediately kicking in. She could hear someone shouting about the water, about someone drowning. Without hesitation, she broke into a sprint toward the commotion. As she pushed through the gathering crowd, Sarah saw the situation unfolding before her. A young Marine in civilian clothes was struggling in the water about 50 yards from shore. The evening tide was particularly strong, and dangerous riptide warnings had been posted earlier in the day. The man was clearly an experienced swimmer, but even the strongest swimmers could be overwhelmed by the ocean's unpredictable currents. "Someone call 911, Sarah shouted as she quickly assessed the situation. The lifeguards had already left for the day, and the nearest lifeguard station was over a mile away. She could see the Marine fighting desperately against the current, his head disappearing beneath the waves for longer periods each time. Several bystanders were on their phones, frantically calling for help. But Sarah knew that emergency responders would take precious minutes to arrive. In drowning situations, every second counted. The Marine's movements were becoming weaker, more erratic. He was losing the battle against exhaustion and the relentless pull of the ocean. Without a moment's hesitation, Sarah kicked off her running shoes and pulled off her jacket. "I'm a nurse," she announced to the crowd. "I'm going in." She had grown up in San Diego and was an accomplished swimmer, having spent countless hours in these very waters during her childhood and teenage years. "Miss, it's too dangerous," an elderly man called out. "The riptide warnings are up." Sarah paused for just a moment, looking at the warning flags fluttering in the evening breeze. She knew the risks. Riptides were responsible for numerous drownings along this stretch of coast every year. But she also knew that the young man in the water had only minutes left before the ocean claimed him completely. "Keep calling for help," she instructed the crowd firmly, "and watch for the rescue boats." With that, Sarah plunged into the cold Pacific waters. The shock of the temperature change hit her immediately, but she pushed through it, focusing on reaching the struggling Marine. She was a strong swimmer, but she could immediately feel the power of the current trying to pull her away from shore. Using techniques she had learned in water safety courses during her nursing training, Sarah approached the Marine from behind, careful not to let him grab onto her in panic. Drowning victims could inadvertently pull their rescuers under in their desperation to stay afloat. "I'm here to help," she called out as she reached him. "I'm a nurse. Try to stay calm." The Marine's name was Jake Thompson, though Sarah wouldn't learn this until later. He was a 25-year-old corporal who had been stationed at Camp Pendleton for the past 2 years. He had come to the beach to clear his head after receiving difficult news from home, never intending to go for a swim. But when he saw a child's beach ball floating away in the dangerous current, his instinct to help had overridden his common sense. Jake had successfully retrieved the ball and thrown it back to shore, but in doing so, he had been caught by the riptide. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but fighting against the ocean's power was unlike any challenge he had faced in his service. When Sarah reached him, Jake was barely conscious, his strength nearly depleted from fighting the current. Sarah quickly positioned herself behind him, hooking her arm across his chest in a rescue hold she had practiced countless times but never used in a real emergency. "Don't fight me," she said firmly but calmly. "Let me do the work. Just try to float." Together they began the arduous journey back to shore. Sarah swam at an angle, not fighting directly against the riptide but working with the ocean's natural patterns to gradually move them toward safety. Her nursing training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, But this was different. The ocean was vast and powerful, and she could feel her own energy beginning to wane. The crowd on shore had grown larger, with people pointing and shouting encouragement. Someone had brought powerful flashlights, creating beacons of light to guide Sarah and Jake toward safety. The distant sound of sirens could be heard approaching, but Sarah knew they couldn't wait for professional rescue. Halfway to shore, Sarah felt Jake's body go limp in her arms. He had lost consciousness, making their situation even more critical. Now she was not only fighting the current, but also supporting the full weight of an unconscious adult male. Her lungs burned from the effort, and her muscles screamed in protest, but she refused to give up. Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Sarah continued swimming toward shore, adjusting her grip on Jake to keep his head above water. The waves seemed to be working against them, each one threatening to separate them or push them further from safety. As they neared the shore, several brave volunteers waded into the water to help pull them to safety. Strong hands grabbed Jake's unconscious form, while others helped support Sarah as she stumbled onto the wet sand, her legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Sarah's focus remained entirely on Jake. She immediately began checking his vital signs, her training taking over even as her own body trembled from cold and exhaustion. Sarah knelt beside Jake's motionless body on the wet sand, her hands automatically moving to check his pulse and breathing. The crowd pressed closer, their earlier cheers replaced by anxious whispers. Jake's lips had a blue tinge and his skin felt cold and clammy beneath her fingertips. He wasn't breathing. "Give me space," Sarah called out authoritatively, her voice cutting through the murmur of concerned voices. "Everyone step back, please." Her years of emergency room experience had taught her that panic was contagious, but so was calm confidence. Without hesitation, Sarah tilted Jake's head back and checked his airway for obstructions. Finding none, she positioned her hands on his chest and began CPR compressions, counting steadily under her breath. The sound of her hands pressing rhythmically against his ribs created an urgent rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the crashing waves nearby. "Come on," she whispered between compressions. "Come back." After 30 compressions, Sarah moved to provide rescue breaths, her lips covering his as she forced air into his lungs. The taste of salt water filled her mouth, but she continued the life-saving procedure without hesitation. She could hear the distant sirens growing louder, but she knew that Jake's brain could only survive a few minutes without oxygen. The seconds felt like hours as Sarah continued the CPR cycle. Her own body was still recovering from the exhausting swim, her muscles aching and her hands cramping, but she refused to stop. Around her, the crowd watched in tense silence, many of them holding their breath along with her. On the fourth cycle of compressions, Jake's body suddenly convulsed. He coughed violently, expelling seawater from his lungs as his eyes fluttered open. Sarah quickly turned him onto his side, supporting his head as he continued to cough up the ocean water he had swallowed. "That's it," she encouraged him gently, her hand on his back. "Get it all out." Jake's eyes were unfocused and confused as he tried to understand where he was and what had happened. The last thing he remembered was the powerful current pulling him under, the desperate fight to keep his head above water, and then darkness. "You're safe," Sarah told him, her voice steady and reassuring. "You're on the beach. I'm Sarah, I'm a nurse. You nearly drowned, but you're going to be okay." The paramedics arrived just as Jake was beginning to sit up, their equipment rattling as they rushed across the sand. Sarah quickly briefed them on Jake's condition and the rescue, her professional demeanor never faltering despite her own exhaustion. "Excellent work," the lead paramedic told her as they prepared to transport Jake to the hospital. "You saved his life." As the ambulance pulled away with Jake inside, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the full impact of what had just happened. Her legs gave out and she sank onto the sand, her body shaking not just from cold but from the adrenaline crash that followed intense physical exertion. A woman from the crowd brought her a blanket and a bottle of water. "You're a hero," she said simply, her eyes filled with admiration. Sarah shook her head weakly. "I just did what anyone would do." But as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, she realized that wasn't entirely true. Many people would have wanted to help, but few would have had the skills, the courage, or the physical ability to actually dive into dangerous waters to save a stranger's life. The next few days passed in a blur for Sarah. The local news picked up the story, and she found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight. Reporters called her phone constantly, and news vans appeared outside her apartment building. She had never sought attention for her actions and felt uncomfortable with the sudden fame. At the hospital where she worked, Sarah's colleagues treated her like a celebrity. The story had spread throughout the medical community, with many praising not just her bravery but her quick thinking in performing CPR on the beach. Her supervisor, Dr. Patricia Williams, pulled her aside during a quiet moment in the emergency room. "Sarah, what you did was remarkable," Dr. Williams said. "Not just the rescue, but the way you handled the medical emergency afterward. You never lost your composure." Sarah appreciated the recognition from her colleagues, but what mattered most to her was knowing that Jake was recovering well. She had called the hospital where he was treated and learned that he was expected to make a full recovery with no lasting effects from his near-drowning experience. What Sarah didn't know was that Jake had been asking about her constantly since regaining consciousness. He had no memory of her face from their time in the water, but he knew that a nurse named Sarah had risked her own life to save his. He wanted desperately to thank her, to express his gratitude for her selfless act. Jake's unit at Camp Pendleton had also learned about the rescue. His commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, had read the news reports with great interest. When he discovered that one of his Marines had been saved by a civilian who risked her own safety, he knew that this was something that needed to be properly acknowledged. "Thompson," Colonel Martinez called Jake into his office 3 days after the incident. "I've been reading about what happened at the beach." Jake stood at attention, unsure if he was in trouble for his reckless decision to chase after the beach ball that had led to his near drowning. "Sir, I know I should have been more careful. I didn't think about the riptide warnings when I saw that child's ball floating away." Colonel Martinez studied the young Marine's face. "Thompson, what you did was impulsive, yes. But your instinct to help others even at personal risk is exactly the kind of character we value in the Marines. However, that's not why I called you here." The colonel walked around his desk and faced Jake directly. "I want to talk about the woman who saved your life, Sarah Martinez. Do you realize what she did for you?" Jake nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "She risked everything to save a complete stranger, sir. I owe her my life." "Yes, you do. And I think it's time we properly thanked her. Not just you, but all of us." Colonel Martinez had been developing an idea since reading about Sarah's heroic actions. In his 25 years of military service, he had seen many acts of bravery and selflessness, but rarely from civilians who had no obligation to put themselves in danger for others. "I'm organizing something special, Thompson. Something that will show this woman how much her actions mean to us as Marines and as Americans." Jake's eyes lit up with curiosity and excitement. "What did you have in mind, sir?" "You'll see. But first we need to find a way to get her to come to the base without spoiling the surprise." Sarah was finishing her morning shift at San Diego General when her supervisor approached her with an unusual request. Dr. Williams looked slightly puzzled as she handed Sarah a formal-looking envelope. "This came for you through official channels," Dr. Williams explained. "It's from Camp Pendleton. Something about a medical consultation they'd like you to participate in." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter on official Marine Corps letterhead, signed by Colonel Martinez. The letter explained that they were conducting a study on emergency medical response in civilian settings and would appreciate her professional input as someone who had recently demonstrated exceptional emergency care skills. The letter was carefully worded to sound legitimate without revealing the true purpose of the invitation. It requested her presence at Camp Pendleton the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. for what was described as a brief consultation and discussion about emergency response protocols. Sarah read the letter twice, feeling both honored and nervous. She had never been on a military base before, and the idea of consulting with Marine Corps medical personnel about emergency procedures was both intimidating and exciting. "Are you going to go?" Dr. Williams asked, having read the letter over Sarah's shoulder. "I think so," Sarah replied, though she felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "It sounds like they want to learn from what happened at the beach. Maybe I can help them improve their emergency response procedures." What Sarah didn't know was that Colonel Martinez had spent the past week carefully orchestrating what would become one of the most memorable moments in Camp Pendleton's recent history. Word of the planned surprise had spread throughout the base, and Marines from various units had volunteered to participate. Jake had been instrumental in planning the event. Though his role was kept secret from Sarah, he had provided detailed accounts of the rescue to ensure that the recognition would be meaningful and appropriate. Despite having no clear memory of Sarah's face from their time in the water, Jake felt a deep connection to the woman who had saved his life. "I want this to be perfect," Jake told Colonel Martinez during one of their planning sessions. "She didn't just save my life. She restored my faith in humanity. Someone who doesn't even know me was willing to risk everything to help me." Colonel Martinez nodded, understanding the profound impact the rescue had on Jake. In his years of military service, he had learned that true heroism often came from unexpected places, and that civilians like Sarah Martinez embodied the very values that Marines fought to protect. The colonel had reached out to Marine units across Southern California, explaining the situation and asking for volunteers to participate in honoring Sarah. The response had been overwhelming. Marines from Camp Pendleton, Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, and even some visiting units from other bases had asked to be included. As Tuesday approached, Sarah found herself growing increasingly nervous about the visit to Camp Pendleton. She had researched the base online and learned about its rich history and the thousands of Marines who trained there. The idea of discussing emergency medical procedures with military medical professionals made her question whether she was qualified to offer any meaningful insights. She decided to dress professionally for the consultation, choosing a conservative navy blue suit that she typically wore to medical conferences. She wanted to make a good impression and represent her profession well. On Tuesday morning, Sarah drove through the gates of Camp Pendleton for the first time. The base was enormous, stretching for miles along the Pacific coast. She was struck by the sense of purpose and discipline that seemed to permeate every aspect of the facility. Marines in camouflage uniforms moved with precision and confidence, and the buildings and grounds were meticulously maintained. Following the directions provided in the letter, Sarah made her way to the designated building. She was greeted by a polite young Marine who checked her identification and provided her with a visitor's badge. "Ma'am, Colonel Martinez is waiting for you in Conference Room B," the Marine informed her. "If you'll follow me, please." As they walked through the corridors of the building, Sarah noticed an unusual number of Marines in the hallways. They seemed to be gathering for something, though she couldn't imagine what. Many of them nodded respectfully as she passed, which she found both puzzling and touching. The Marine escort led her to a door marked Conference Room B and knocked politely before opening it. "Ma'am, your visitor is here," he announced. Sarah stepped into what she expected to be a conference room, but instead found herself in a large assembly hall. The sight that greeted her was unlike anything she could have imagined. Hundreds of Marines in dress blue uniforms filled the room, standing at attention in perfect formation. The sight was breathtaking and overwhelming. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, completely confused about what was happening. Colonel Martinez stepped forward from the front of the formation, his bearing commanding and respectful. Jake stood beside him, though Sarah didn't immediately recognize him as the man she had rescued from the ocean. "Ms. Martinez," Colonel Martinez began, his voice carrying clearly through the large room. "Thank you for coming today. I'm afraid we weren't entirely truthful about the reason we asked you here." Sarah's heart began to race as she realized that this gathering was somehow connected to her. She looked around the room at the sea of Marines, their faces serious and respectful. 2 weeks ago, Colonel Martinez continued, "You performed an act of extraordinary courage and selflessness. You risked your own life to save one of our Marines, Corporal Jake Thompson, from drowning in dangerous conditions." Jake stepped forward, and Sarah finally recognized him as the man she had pulled from the ocean. He looked completely different in his dress uniform, healthy and strong, with clear eyes that reflected deep gratitude. "Ma'am," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. You didn't know me anything, but you risked everything to save my life." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the magnitude of the moment began to sink in. This entire gathering was to honor her actions at the beach. Colonel Martinez raised his hand and the entire room fell into absolute silence. "Ms. Martinez, what you did embodies the very best of American values. You demonstrated courage, selflessness, and a commitment to helping others that exemplifies what we as Marines strive to represent." He paused, looking directly at Sarah with sincere respect. On behalf of the United States Marine Corps and every Marine in this room, we want to express our deepest gratitude for your heroic actions. The colonel nodded to someone at the back of the room, and suddenly the sound of a single pair of hands clapping began to echo through the hall. The single applause started from the back of the room and rippled forward like a wave. One by one, each Marine joined in until the entire assembly hall thundered with the sound of 500 pairs of hands clapping in unison. The sound was overwhelming, powerful, and deeply moving. Sarah stood in the doorway, completely overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. Tears streamed down her face as she looked out at the sea of Marines, all of them applauding her actions with genuine respect and gratitude. She had never experienced anything like this in her life. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few minutes. Each clap seemed to echo with appreciation, not just for her rescue of Jake, but for the selfless spirit that had driven her to act without thinking of her own safety. Colonel Martinez allowed the applause to continue, understanding that this moment meant as much to his Marines as it did to Sarah. In a world where negative news often dominated headlines, Sarah's story represented something pure and good that reminded everyone why they served. When the applause finally began to fade, Colonel Martinez stepped forward again. "Ms. Martinez, would you please join me at the front of the room?" Sarah walked through the formation of Marines, her legs feeling unsteady from the emotional intensity of the moment. As she passed, she could see the genuine admiration in their faces. These were men and women who had dedicated their lives to serving others, and they recognized in her the same spirit of selfless service. Jake fell into step beside her as they made their way to the front of the room. "I still can't believe you did what you did," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "When I think about what could have happened if you hadn't been there." Sarah looked at him, seeing not just the Marine in his dress uniform, but the frightened young man she had pulled from the ocean. "I couldn't just stand there and watch," she replied softly. "You would have done the same thing." "I hope I would have," Jake admitted. "But I'm not sure I would have had the courage." When they reached the front of the room, Colonel Martinez gestured for Sarah to stand beside him, facing the assembled Marines. The sight from this vantage point was even more impressive. Hundreds of perfectly aligned Marines stood at attention, their uniforms immaculate, their bearing proud and respectful. "Marines," Colonel Martinez announced, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Ms. Martinez's actions remind us that heroism isn't limited to those who wear the uniform. Courage and selflessness can be found in ordinary citizens who choose to do extraordinary things when the moment demands it." He turned to Sarah, holding a beautifully crafted wooden plaque. "Ms. Martinez, while we cannot give you a military decoration, we can express our gratitude in our own way. This is a certificate of appreciation from the United States Marine Corps, recognizing your heroic actions in saving the life of Corporal Jake Thompson." Sarah accepted the plaque with trembling hands, reading the inscription that formally recognized her rescue efforts. The weight of the wood felt substantial in her hands, but the weight of the moment felt even heavier. "Thank you," she managed to say, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "This means more to me than you could possibly know." Colonel Martinez nodded to the formation, and once again the room erupted in applause. This time, however, the applause was accompanied by something even more powerful. The Marines began to give her a standing ovation, their clapping more enthusiastic and heartfelt than before. As the applause continued, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening. Individual Marines were breaking into smiles, their usually stoic expressions softening with genuine warmth. She realized that this moment was as meaningful to them as it was to her. In honoring her actions, they were also celebrating the values they held dear. When the applause finally died down, Colonel Martinez made another announcement. "Ms. Martinez, we have one more surprise for you. Corporal Thompson has prepared something special." Jake stepped forward, his usually confident demeanor showing a touch of nervousness. He had spent days preparing for this moment, wanting to express his gratitude in a way that would truly convey the impact Sarah had on his life. "Ma'am," Jake began, his voice clear and strong. "Before that day at the beach, I was going through a difficult time in my life. I had received some bad news from home, and I was questioning a lot of things about my future and my purpose." Sarah listened intently, surprised to learn that Jake had been struggling with personal issues when she rescued him. When I ended up in that water, fighting for my life, I thought that might be the end of my story. But you changed everything. Not just by saving my life, but by showing me that there are still people in this world who will risk everything to help a stranger. Jake's voice became more emotional as he continued. You gave me more than my life back, ma'am. You gave me hope. You reminded me that there's still goodness in the world worth fighting for. He gestured to the assembled Marines behind him. Every person in this room has sworn an oath to protect and defend others. But you didn't need an oath or a uniform to do the right thing. You just did it because it was right. Sarah wiped away fresh tears as Jake's words sank in. She had thought of the rescue as a simple act of helping someone in need. But hearing Jake describe the broader impact of her actions made her realize that sometimes small acts of courage could have far-reaching consequences. I've spoken with many of my fellow Marines about what happened, Jake continued, and every one of them said the same thing. They said that you represent the very best of what we're fighting to protect. You represent the America we believe in, where people look out for each other and where ordinary citizens can be heroes. The room was completely silent as Jake finished speaking, his words hanging in the air with profound significance. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with being seen as a symbol of something larger than herself. Colonel Martinez stepped forward again, sensing that the moment was perfect for his final surprise. Ms. Martinez, we have one last token of our appreciation. Corporal Thompson has informed us that you're a runner, and that you were actually out for your evening jog when you encountered him in the water. Sarah nodded, wondering where this was leading. We'd like to invite you to participate in our annual Marine Corps Marathon Relay Team. You would run alongside some of our finest Marines in honor of the courage you displayed. Would you be willing to accept this invitation? Sarah's eyes widened in surprise and delight. She had always dreamed of running in events with elite athletes, and the idea of representing the Marine Corps in their marathon was both thrilling and intimidating. I would be honored, she replied, her voice stronger now. Absolutely honored. The months following the ceremony at Camp Pendleton transformed Sarah's life in ways she never could have anticipated. Word of the Marine Corps recognition had spread beyond the military community, and she found herself invited to speak at various events about courage, emergency preparedness, and civilian heroism. Sarah accepted these speaking engagements reluctantly at first, still uncomfortable with the attention her actions had brought. But she soon realized that her story was inspiring others to think about how they might respond in emergency situations. She began volunteering to teach CPR and water safety courses at community centers throughout San Diego. Her relationship with Jake had evolved into a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. They met regularly for coffee, and Jake often attended Sarah's safety courses, sharing his perspective as someone whose life had been saved by quick thinking and proper emergency response. You know what I think about most? Jake told her during one of their coffee meetings. It's not just that you saved my life. It's that you showed me what real courage looks like. It's not the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear because someone needs help. Sarah smiled, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. I was terrified that whole time in the water. I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. But when I saw you struggling out there, the fear became less important than getting you to safety. Their friendship had become a source of strength for both of them. Jake's personal struggles that had led him to the beach that evening had resolved with time and the perspective that came from his near-death experience. He had reconnected with his family and found renewed purpose in his military service. Sarah's training for the Marine Corps Marathon had become a consuming passion. Colonel Martinez had assigned Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's top fitness instructor, to help prepare her for the relay. The training was more intense than anything she had experienced, but she embraced the challenge with determination. Martinez, you're stronger than half the Marines I train, Master Sergeant Rodriguez told her after a particularly grueling workout session. Your cardiovascular endurance is outstanding, but we need to work on your speed and your mental toughness for race conditions. The training sessions took place 3 times a week at Camp Pendleton, and Sarah found herself becoming part of the extended Marine family. The Marines who trained alongside her treated her with a respect that went far beyond her rescue of Jake. They recognized her dedication and work ethic as qualities that aligned with their own values. As the marathon approached, Sarah's story continued to spread. Local news stations followed her training progress, and a national sports network expressed interest in covering her participation in the relay. The attention made Sarah nervous, but she was determined not to let it distract from her preparation. "The pressure is getting to you," Jake observed during one of their training runs together. "I can see it in your face." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the stress she was feeling. "Everyone expects so much now. What if I don't run well? What if I let the team down?" Jake stopped running and turned to face her. "Sarah, listen to me. You've already done the hardest thing. You've already proven your courage and your character. The marathon is just a run. You've already saved a life." His words helped put things in perspective for Sarah. The marathon was an honor and a privilege, but it wasn't the measure of her worth or the significance of her actions that day at the beach. 3 weeks before the marathon, Sarah received an unexpected phone call at work. Dr. Williams approached her with a puzzled expression, holding the phone. "Sarah, there's someone on the line who says she's calling from the White House. She wants to speak with you about some kind of award ceremony." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she took the phone. The caller identified herself as a member of the White House staff, responsible for coordinating civilian recognition awards. She explained that Sarah had been nominated for the Presidential Life-Saving Award, the highest civilian honor for life-saving actions. "Ms. Martinez, the President would like to present this award to you personally in a ceremony at the White House. Would you be available to travel to Washington, D.C. next month?" Sarah was speechless for several moments, trying to process what she was hearing. The Presidential Life-Saving Award was something she had read about but never imagined receiving. The ceremony would take place just 2 weeks after the Marine Corps Marathon. Yes, of course. I'm honored beyond words," Sarah finally managed to say. When she hung up the phone, Dr. Williams was staring at her with amazement. "The White House? Sarah, do you realize how incredible this is?" The news of the Presidential Award spread quickly through the hospital and the broader San Diego community. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the congratulations and attention, but also deeply moved by the recognition her actions were receiving at the highest levels of government. Jake was thrilled when Sarah called to tell him about the award. "This is amazing, Sarah. You deserve this recognition. What you did that day represented the very best of American values." As the marathon weekend approached, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of the night before major medical procedures at the hospital. She had trained hard and felt physically prepared, but the emotional weight of representing the Marine Corps added a layer of pressure she had never experienced in her running. The night before the race, the Marine relay team gathered for a final meeting. Sarah was running the third leg of the relay, a challenging 7-mile section that included several hills. Her teammates were experienced marathon runners who had competed in numerous military athletics competitions. Martinez, Staff Sergeant Williams, the team captain, addressed her. "Tomorrow isn't about your time or your performance. It's about representing the values that brought us all together. You've already proven you have the heart of a Marine. Tomorrow you just need to run like one." The team spent the evening sharing stories about their military service and their motivation for running. Sarah told them about her work as a nurse and how her medical training had prepared her to respond in emergency situations. "You know what I realized during training?" Sarah said to the group. "Running with you has taught me that courage is something you can develop through practice and preparation. The more prepared you are, the more confident you become in challenging situations." Sergeant Martinez, the team's veteran runner, nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. Mental toughness comes from knowing you've done the work and trusting in your preparation." As Sarah prepared for sleep that night, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been an ordinary nurse living a quiet life. A single act of courage had changed everything, connecting her with an extended family of Marines and opening doors she never could have imagined. The recognition she was receiving felt overwhelming at times, but she was beginning to understand that her story had become larger than just her rescue of Jake. It had become a symbol of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of civilians and military personnel united by shared values of service and sacrifice. Marathon morning arrived with perfect weather conditions. The sun rose over the Pacific coast as hundreds of runners gathered at the starting line in Washington, D.C. Sarah had flown across the country with her Marine relay teammates, and the magnitude of the event was both thrilling and intimidating. The Marine Corps Marathon was known as the People's Marathon, attracting runners from all branches of military service as well as civilian. participants from around the world. Sarah watched in awe as Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen prepared for the race alongside weekend warriors and elite athletes. "You ready for this, Martinez?" Staff Sergeant Williams asked as they went through their final warm-up routine. Sarah nodded, though her stomach was filled with butterflies. "As ready as I'll ever be. I keep thinking about all the people who are counting on me to represent them well." Jake had flown in to watch the race, along with Colonel Martinez and several other Marines from Camp Pendleton. Seeing their familiar faces in the crowd gave Sarah an additional boost of confidence. The relay format meant that Sarah would begin her 7-mile leg after her teammates had completed the first 2 sections. She waited at the transition point, stretching and mentally preparing for her portion of the race. When she saw her teammate approaching in the distance carrying the relay baton, her heart rate spiked with anticipation. The handoff was smooth and professional. Sarah took the baton and began her leg of the race feeling strong and confident. The first mile felt effortless, her months of training with the Marines having prepared her well for the physical demands of the course. As she ran through the streets of the nation's capital, Sarah was struck by the crowds of spectators lining the route. Many of them held signs supporting military runners, and she could hear people shouting encouragement specifically for the Marine relay team. Around mile 3, Sarah began to feel the pace. The Marine training had prepared her for this level of intensity, but sustaining it for 7 miles required mental toughness as much as physical conditioning. She focused on her breathing and her form, drawing on the techniques Master Sergeant Rodriguez had drilled into her during their training sessions. The hills came in miles 4 and 5, just as her coaches had warned her they would. Sarah felt her legs beginning to burn, but she remembered Staff Sergeant Williams' words about running like a Marine. She shortened her stride slightly and pumped her arms more aggressively, attacking the hills rather than just surviving them. Spectators along the hilliest section of the course were particularly vocal in their support. Sarah could hear individual voices shouting, "Go Marines!" and "You've got this." The energy from the crowd seemed to flow directly into her legs, giving her strength when she needed it most. As she crested the final hill and began the descent toward the transition point for the final leg, Sarah realized she was running faster than her target pace. The combination of adrenaline, months of preparation, and the emotional significance of the race had pushed her beyond what she thought was possible. She could see the transition area in the distance, and she could make out the figure of Corporal Jenkins, who would run the final leg for their team. Sarah pushed harder, wanting to give him the best possible position for the team's finish. The handoff to Jenkins was perfectly executed, and Sarah watched him disappear into the distance carrying their hopes for a strong team finish. Her own race was complete, but the emotional high of the experience continued to surge through her body. Jake found her in the recovery area, wrapping her in a huge hug despite her sweaty condition. "Sarah, that was incredible. You were flying out there." Colonel Martinez approached with a broad smile on his face. "Martinez, that was outstanding running. You just posted the 2nd fastest time ever recorded by a civilian on our relay team." Sarah was too exhausted and emotionally overwhelmed to fully process what she was hearing. She had simply focused on running her best race and representing the Marines with honor. The time seemed less important than the feeling that she had given everything she had to the effort. When Corporal Jenkins crossed the finish line an hour later, the Marine relay team had posted their best time in 5 years. Sarah's leg had been instrumental in setting up their strong finish, and her teammates made sure she knew how proud they were of her contribution. The celebration continued long into the evening at a reception hosted by Marine Corps leadership. Sarah found herself surrounded by Marines from various units, all of them eager to congratulate her on both her race performance and her recognition as a civilian hero. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in the Oval Office of the White House, wearing her best professional suit and trying to control her nervousness. The Presidential Life-Saving Award ceremony was intimate, with only a small group of family members, military officials, and White House staff in attendance. Jake was there, of course, along with Colonel Martinez and her parents, who had flown in from Arizona. Dr. Williams had also been invited, representing Sarah's professional community at San Diego General Hospital. The president entered the room with the characteristic confidence of someone accustomed to historic moments. After brief introductions, he asked Sarah to stand beside him as he prepared to present the award. "Ms. Martinez," the president began, Your actions on that beach in San Diego represent the very best of American character. Without regard for your own safety, you chose to risk everything to save the life of a stranger. That kind of courage and selflessness is what makes our nation great. He handed her the beautiful crystal award, its weight substantial in her hands. The inscription read simply, Presidential Life-Saving Award, Sarah Martinez, for extraordinary heroism in saving human life. Thank you, Mr. President, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I was just doing what I hope anyone would do in that situation. The president smiled. That's exactly what makes you special, Ms. Martinez. You see extraordinary courage as ordinary responsibility. That's the mark of a true hero. After the formal ceremony, the president spent several minutes talking with Sarah and Jake about their experience and their friendship. He was particularly interested in how the rescue had led to Sarah's involvement with the Marines and her participation in the marathon. What I find remarkable, the president observed, is how one moment of courage created ripple effects that continue to inspire others. Your story has been shared around the world as an example of civilian heroism. As Sarah flew back to San Diego that evening, she reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with a simple evening jog along the beach. Her life had been transformed not just by her own actions, but by the generosity and recognition of others who saw in her story something worth celebrating. The Presidential Life-Saving Award sat carefully packed in her carry-on bag, but the real treasure was the relationships and experiences that had grown from that moment of crisis at the beach. Her friendship with Jake had deepened into something that felt like family. Her connection with the Marines had given her a new appreciation for service and sacrifice. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered something about herself that she never knew existed. She had always been a competent nurse and a caring person, but she had never seen herself as someone capable of heroic action. The events of the past year had shown her that courage wasn't something you were born with, but something you chose in moments of crisis. When she returned to work at San Diego General Hospital the following Monday, Sarah was greeted by a surprise celebration, organized by her colleagues. The emergency room was decorated with banners congratulating her on the Presidential Award, and Dr. Williams presented her with a framed photo of the ceremony. Sarah, Dr. Williams said to the assembled staff, you've brought honor not just to yourself, but to all of us who work in emergency medicine. You've shown the world what it means to be prepared to help others in their moment of greatest need. As the celebration continued around her, Sarah thought about Jake, who was back at Camp Pendleton preparing for deployment overseas. Their friendship had been forged in crisis but had grown into something lasting and meaningful. They had promised to stay in touch, and Sarah knew that the bond between them would endure regardless of distance or time. The recognition and awards had been wonderful, but what mattered most to Sarah was the knowledge that her actions had saved a life and inspired others to think about how they might respond in similar situations. She had returned to her regular life as a nurse, but she carried with her the confidence that came from knowing she could rise to meet extraordinary challenges when circumstances demanded it. In quiet moments, Sarah sometimes thought about that evening at the beach and wondered what would have happened if she had chosen differently, but she knew in her heart that there had never really been a choice. When someone needed help, you helped. When someone was drowning, you dove in. It was that simple and that profound.